Hello, everybody. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Amy. Thanks to all the other organizers for the invitation to participate and for putting together this conference and this group. Let me share my screen. Okay. So I'm presenting this book, Powering Empire. It came out last year, and it concerns questions that are right at the core of this conference. I even considered titling it Colonialism, C-O-A-L, until my publisher thought otherwise. And the book is an attempt to introduce history in general and history of empire in particular and history of imperialism in the Middle East, more particularly still, to the conversation about the grandest crisis of the 21st century, the climate crisis, and about the grandest challenge of the present global decarbonization, a challenge that concerns mainly people working on the present and the future and people working on the natural sciences. But as a historian, I wish to point out a rather astonishing fact that with all the talk about global decarbonization as the horizon we should all aspire towards, we have yet to come up with a roadmap, with a historical roadmap of global carbonization, with the story of how the hydrocarbon economy was proliferated, how it went global. And this is what my book attempts to do. This historical roadmap, I think, helps clear out of the way several myths and troubled preconceptions that still inform how we talk about decarbonization. And here I only have time to zoom in on one such intervention. So instead of the diffusional model of the history of technology, the story of first in Europe, then elsewhere, I replaced this story with two-directional and global history. As a historian of the Middle East, even before researching and writing this book, I knew that the dependence of this region on coal began in the 1830s, which is right around when the British Isles started developing their own coal addiction. You know, the Middle East, with all its current association on oil and on American imperialism, has a history, and these extractive impulses actually stand on the shoulders of British imperialism and on coal coming into the region from the British Isles rather than liquid fossil fuels leaving it going elsewhere. And this simultaneity or two-directionality, or the fact that the Industrial Revolution was a global process, that it happened in Egypt and in England roughly at the same time, I mean mainly the second Industrial Revolution, is quite significant because if these spaces like the Middle East that were so far under the radar actually fully participated in the process of global carbonization, then perhaps they have intellectual, political, even theological resources that can help us rethink not only the history, but also the challenge of decarbonization today. And the corridor between Port Said and Aden, the maritime corridor which runs through the heart of my book, is a perfect setting to demonstrate this argument. From the 1820s and onwards, the British are creating there and elsewhere an artificial archipelago of coaling stations or fueling depots in equal intervals between Gibraltar, Malta, Port Said, Aden, all the way to Bombay. But calling these places fueling stations or coaling depots actually draws our attention away from the real motivation of their architects, which was not so much fueling, not so much energy, but land grab, imperial expansion. So, for example, during the 1830s, when the governor of Ottoman Egypt, Mehmet Ali Pasha, proposes to the British to construct and maintain at his own expense a coaling depot in Aden, his proposal is flatly rejected. It is clear to everybody that the British are interested in capturing a land grab in the coffee trade around Mocha, which is the first coal depot in Aden. They're interested in the deep water port of Aden, in the strategic location in the Gulf of Aden. It is also clear to everybody that Mehmet Ali Pasha is likewise looking for excuses for Egypt's own imperialist expansion. So, in fact, the spread of coaling depots, if we want to call them that, is actually the prehistory of what we today call energy security and wrongly date to the 1970s and to the age of oil. And in fact, it is a story where security is just security or land grab is the main motivation, and coaling is just the excuse. So when we use the language, when we talk of coal only in the language of energy, only in the language of fuel, we actually take part in imperialist rhetorics, in imperialist excuses and agendas, exactly when we should be critical of these kinds of rhetorics. Now, the two stations called Port Said and Aden are very good to think with about this process of global carbonization for several respects. They are boom towns, certainly when we look at their human population. So Port Said, to take one example, has only 150 people in 1859, but in 1869, when the Suez Canal is inaugurated, Port Said, of course, is the canal town at the Mediterranean mouth of the Suez Canal. The town already has 10,000 people, and in 1882, the time of the British occupation of Egypt, it already has 1,800 people. But Port Said and Aden and other coaling stations is also a multi-species boom town. And to understand what I mean by this, I can elaborate a little bit on how Port Said is created. So much of the land for establishing the coaling depot is created by a process of land reclamation, the stretching of long wharves into the sea, and a solar evaporation of seawater to create the land on which the infrastructure would be built. The process is compounded by another transformation wrought by steam navigation. You know, we tend to think of coal only as an energy source, but mariners, steam captains, and ship owners think of it also and arguably mainly as a ballast, as a make-weight, as something that would keep their ships low enough in the water, bottom heavy enough in the water, and would solve a problem of buoyancy. You know, when a ship leaves to the open sea where it is subjected to the lateral forces of the winds and the waves, if it is not heavy enough, it might capsize. And coal actually, before it is an energy source, it is just that kind of make weight. And this is how coal first spreads to the Middle East in the first half of the 19th century on board sail ships. But in the second half of the 19th century, when more and more ships begin to introduce steam engines and shift to steam navigation, a buoyancy problem rears its head, because as these steam engines consume coal supplies, the ship rises sometimes an inch or an inch and a third a day. This is very dangerous. It opens up the risk of capsizing, and it requires a solution. And the standardized solution from the second half of the 19th century is water ballasting. It's a contraption that connects the steam engine to a water pump that sucks in seawater instead of the weight lost during the combustion of coal. This is a wonderful solution, but in turn, it creates its own problem. Today we know that water ballasting is the main vector for marine pollution, because what you basically do is suck in the oceanic soup, seawater with all its flora and fauna, with the zoo and phytoplankton from one part of the sea, and you dump it in another part of the sea, where it introduces new species into the ecology. This process is compounded in Port Said by another process that marine biologists call Lessepian migration, after Ferdinand de Lesseps, the founder of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal famously connects the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. It not only connects them physically, but it also standardizes their salinity, the water's salinity and temperature, thereby allowing a migration of marine species from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. Now, this compounded with water ballasting actually completely transforms the marine ecology of Port Said. We're used to thinking of the spread of fossil fuels with the sixth mass extinction, the reduction of biodiversity. This is, of course, sadly true. But interestingly, in the beginning of the process, we actually see a proliferation of invading species in new environments where they are unfamiliar. In Port Said, this allows for the sustenance and the increase of human populations, because when you have new marine creatures, this attracts fish, and the fish attracts water birds like pelicans or duck or storks and other species, and all these can be fished or hunted. Moreover, in order to sustain humans in Port Said, already in the 1850s, we see the introduction of desalination devices, coal-fired machines that separate the salt from potable water. And the desalted water can be consumed, they can be drunk, and that they can also be used in ice machines, also coal-fired, and the ice and also the salt can increase the life of the fish and the birds that are hunted in Port Said's vicinity, and allow them to be sold in the Egyptian interior, in Port Said's coastal neighbors, and it becomes a booming economic sector. But lest we think of this multi-species interaction as a story of convivencia, I should hasten to add that this multiplicity is quickly reduced with familiar modes of intercommunal strife and familiar kinds of politics. So, for example, we see a differential distribution of fishing rights, wherein Egyptians can only fish with rods and nets, whereas subjects of European councils can fish with dynamite and can shoot water birds with firearms, and this creates rifts in fishers' communities. The desalted water likewise separates communities of would-be locals, people who refuse to drink this water, who are regarded as dead water. We're talking about these Egyptians, we're talking about their animals. By the way, we know today that desalted water with no minerals actually can create a process of reverse osmosis and are quite injurious to one's health. But these people are ridiculed as unmodern at the 19th century. At any rate, they refuse to drink this water, and Europeans drink desalted water. So we see that the water created by coal is also a stuff that separates communities. The reclaimed land, this terra nullius, likewise becomes a bone of contention between the Egyptian government and the foreign consulates about property rights. And rapidly we see that a place that has no locals to it, I remind you that in 1859, there are only 150 people, and very rapidly it attracts thousands of foreigners. Everybody's foreigner in Port Said, but with the arrival of these invading species, many of these species undergo a process of indigenization. They climatize, they become locals, and many of the Egyptians likewise become natives And Port Said is one of the emblematic examples of a divided city with European quarters and Egyptian quarters. This is one kind of dimension of how coal actually creates new forms of politics and new forms of intercommunal tension that project themselves to the past and appear pre-modern. I should also point out that this is a historical story, but it has tremendous relevance also for this day. Many places in the Middle East, in the Arabian Peninsula, in Israel, where I'm talking from, so Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, other places are completely reliant on desalted water. Today, water desalination is carried out through oil power, but this completely rests on the shoulders of imperialist strategies and technologies that were developed in these arid environments, and the kinds of politics that they create, the kinds of ways that the government that controls this infrastructure binds its populations to it. Another aspect of coal in these arid environments, one of the very exciting potentials of it is how it produces coal. You know, we tend to think of coal only as a producer of heat. It evaporates water into steam, thereby allowing motion. But in the 19th century, many people are even more excited about the cooling potential of coal. So as one anonymous observer points out, if beverages can be cooled by means of ice, if meat and other articles of food can be preserved in good condition for some time by its agency, if these things be so, then some at least of the miseries that press upon the white man in a hot climate might be alleviated, and we might then really see what northern muscles can affect in southern regions. Indeed, ice, coal-fired ice, is quite significant in cooling northern muscles of humans and of non-humans. Since we are at least virtually hosted in Australia, I might point out that it is exactly refrigeration ships that use their steam engines to produce ice. This is exactly what globalizes meat production and carnivority and connects in the 1870s and 1880s places like Argentina and Australia to Western Europe, proliferating carnivority worldwide. But this ice also cools southern muscles and the muscles of humans. You know, I tend to think of the steamship as the all-weather ship. And indeed, if we compare it to the sail ship, and if we look only at the wind, this is indeed the case. Unlike the wind, the whims of the wind that prevent sail ships from sailing in the monsoon, for example, steamers can sail in every season. They can sail straight, hence their name liners. But if we think of heat, then the sail ship becomes the all-weather ship, and the steamer, certainly in hot, sweltering environments like the Gulf of Aden, like the Red Sea, has tremendous difficulty in navigating during the summer months. In the engine rooms of steamships, temperatures can reach as high as 70 degrees Celsius and more. And this is crippling for such vessels who try to sail in August. And this requires recruiting people who are considered to be heat resistant, Adani and Somali stokers and firemen, called human salamanders after the mythical leaders infesting the flames of hell. There's a new physiology, a new racialized physiology in the 19th century that begins to describe their diathermy, their heat resistance. And the way these people who are far from being heat resistant, of course, are being employed is that they are locked in engine rooms made to feed the engines with coal until they collapse from heat stroke. Then they are taken to the upper decks and resuscitated with an ice bath with the very ice that is produced in coaling stations like Port Said. So this is again another example of how technologies and actors that that are developed, or labor practices that are developed away from Western Europe, away from North America, are indispensable for the operation of steam navigation in these theaters. In order not to conclude only with oppression and exploitation, I also want to point out that these theaters also develop forms of resistance. So, for example, when Gandhi passes through Aden in the 1880s on his way to his studies in England, this is where he becomes a vegetarian. This is where he, in the first time, connects vegetarianism and anti-imperialism. This is also where he notices salt, which he would later famously use as a substance for anti-imperial resistance. And Gandhian thought is actually translated and discussed by Islamic pilgrims, by Hujjaj from South Asia, traveling to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, by Islamic reformers in Egypt. And since carnivority is such an important feature of the age of coal in the 19th century, we also see vegetarianism and resistance to carnivority and intercommunal solidarity and coalition between Hindus and Muslims, agreements on the avoidance of slaughtering cows, for example, as strategies for anti-imperial resistance. We in the West tend to think of vegetarianism as an individualist life choice. But in these settings, we have another option of intercommunal solidarity, which also connects anti-imperialism to modes of addressing or of surviving in the Anthropocene. Of course, renouncing meat is as, if not more important than giving up cars. So this is just one horizon of the system that I'm describing. There are many more such horizons or potentials from how Ottomans think of fossil fuels. For example, they think of coal with the Islamic category of rikaz, of buried treasures that God deposits in the underground for the benefit of the entire community, thereby severing the profit motive from the extraction of fossil fuels. They think about these fuels with another Islamic category of tabakat. They create an analogy between cohorts of Islamic scholars and layers of the earth. Stratigraphy, the division of the underground into strata corresponding to geological epochs, such as the Anthropocene, thereby allowing the reintroduction of intergenerational responsibility and various kinds of Islamic ethics into our thinking about fossil fuels. There are many other examples that illustrate the main point on which I would conclude, that imperial peripheries were absolutely indispensable for the spread of the hydrocarbon economy. Without workers in Aden, in Port Said, without their exploitation, without firemen and stokers in the Gulf of Aden, and cooking them, but also resuscitating them with ice baths, without the ice, without the meat, without desalinated water that allow for the existence of foreign garrisons that would secure and maintain coaling depots and fueling stations. Steamships would not be able to move in these theaters. And I think that any vision for global decarbonization has to take this entanglement of East and West under consideration, has to consider the historical and also contemporary actors in these settings. And I think the role that the colonies played in global carbonization teases out worldviews that can be recycled, that help us rethink about our own present. Let me be very clear, I'm not trying to sell some kind of romantic black savior or an indigenous ethics that would save Gaia. On the contrary, what I'm proposing here is that we begin to recycle resources that are pre-existing, that are implicated with fossil fuels, but that developed in languages that are not necessarily English, and through life experiences that are not necessarily liberal or secular, to integrate liberty with responsibility, to integrate justice into our conversation, and to rethink how we decenter the human in a multiple entanglement of powers. Thank you very much.